Hello, my name's Tara Garnett, and I'm part of the LEAP project, and I also run an initiative called Table. And welcome to this session on behaviour and demand. Because it's a tight session and lots of really interesting talks, I'm going to keep this very brief. We have 3 presentations involving 4 speakers, and hopefully 2 of them will be joining us shortly. Yes, so we're going to have each session for about 7 minutes. So speakers, please keep to time, because then that will allow a little bit of time for questions. When you post your questions, hopefully, please can you post them in the Q&A of the Zoom. But if you end up posting in Hover, hopefully Viola will just forward them on to me. So I'll try and get onto those too. So and we finish here at 12:20. So please do remember to go back to the Hover website to join the next event. So for our first speaker, I have pleasure in introducing Kate Sievert, who's going to be focusing on who has a stake in it, understanding narratives and actor power in the food system, a case study on red and processed meat. Kate's in the final year of her PhD at Deakin University, but she's also worked for the Public Health Association of Australia and the World Health Organization. Her PhD explores the politics and political economy of the food system, with a particular focus on power dynamics in relation to red and processed meat, ultra-processed foods, and infant formula. So, Kate, over to you. If you could share your screen and keep to time. Thank you.
Now, which can you see? Can you see the presenter view, or?
I can see the little slides on the left as well. So it's now it's in presenter view.
Now it's full now,
yeah.
And if I switch that, is that right?
This is good. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Great. Alrighty. Well, thank you for coming to hear me talk today. I'm going to be talking about one of the studies from my PhD, looking at narratives and actor power in relation to red and processed meat. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I don't think I need to stay here too long, given you all work in this exact area, but I will just say that red and processed meat represent a really complex problem in healthy and sustainable food systems. So red meat can be a part of a diet that's healthy and can be produced in environmentally friendly ways. Red and processed meats are also a big part of many cultures and bring enjoyment and tradition to people's lives, as well as employment. But they're also tied with health issues like cancer and antimicrobial resistance, and environmental issues like high carbon emissions and land biodiversity loss. And intensive production methods can be incredibly cruel for both animals and humans. I'm going to use the word meat here from here on out, just in place of red and processed meat, otherwise I will trip over the entire presentation. But to try and mitigate some of these more serious harms, organisations like WHO, the IPCC and the Eat Lancet Commission have called for global reductions in production and consumption of meat. But this recommendation has proven to be very divisive in public discourse and highly criticised by people from the meat industry, by governments like my own in Australia, but also Brazil and the US, and of course from citizens who fear their choices to be threatened. So we wanted to understand the views of some of these stakeholders, as well as all actors with an interest in red and processed meat, to see how they frame the issue, which interests seem to hold the most power, and which actors are perceived to be more influential when it comes to both policymaking and agenda setting. So we used a case study and framing analysis method through Zoom-based semi-structured interviews in July through to September this year. So I interviewed 32 participants, 9 academics, 5 officers from UN agencies or intergovernmental organizations, 6 people from the meat or novel protein industries, as well as global trade organizations, and 12 representatives from civil society organizations. Just a note here, this paper is yet to be submitted for peer review, so I just want to stress that these are preliminary results, and as a result, could I just ask that the following slides with a no photo sign are not shared to Twitter or anywhere. Thanks. I also only have 7 minutes here, so I'm just really discussing a few of the themes. This was a mammoth paper to try and synthesize. So if you're interested in learning more, hopefully the full results will be published in the first half of next year. So in contrast to prior evidence, including my own previously published work on polarization in the media, most participants actually had quite similar views on what role red and processed meat should play in a healthy and sustainable food system. And the resounding response was, yes, it has a role, but it's complicated. Despite this, almost all participants felt like everyone else was too extreme and polarized, so either totally for or totally against meat reduction. So referring to this need for nuance, this particular academic felt that simplifications were being made by both advocates and proponents of reducing meat. And I've just got a little quote there, which I won't linger on too long because I don't have that much time. So what makes it complicated? First and foremost, red and processed meat are often grouped together without distinction, especially ultra-processed meat, and recommendations were not considered to be specific enough. Other complexities were around the limitations of the evidence base, a need for context and nuance in the recommendations, and what the trade-offs or consequences might be when reducing meat. So what role of novel proteins and their own health and environmental limitations. So unfortunately, to keep the time, I'm only going to touch on these briefly, but when we're talking about solutions, these were the most commonly raised, but most frequently raised was limiting consumption in the global north, breaking up the highly concentrated global market, diversifying our protein sources, and democratizing the food system. And that's another quote there. So a resounding framing by predominantly academic and civil society participants was that the variety of harmful outcomes from red and processed meat are a result of the industrial meat supply chain. So large-scale corporate producers were framed as primarily responsible for perpetuating cheap meat products through externalizing health, environmental, and welfare costs of production, which brings us to the pointing fingers section of the study. So unfortunately, even though a wide variety of actors were ascribed as having an influential role in the food system, I only have time to talk about a few. So since I've just talked about the corporatized supply chain, I'll start with the framing of the meat industry and the novel protein industry. So most of the industry participants who agreed to be interviewed were not from major meatpacking companies. So they were keen to separate themselves from their industrial counterparts. And there was a tension noted here around the fact that some of these larger companies were double dipping, so dominating the meat market, but also trying to buy up novel protein startups to cover all bases. And whilst seen as still having a sizable stake in the landscape, including at the recent UN Food Systems Summit, their influence was seen as waning by several academic participants. Novel protein companies, on the other hand, were seen as growing in influence. So almost no participant, with the exception of those actually from novel protein companies, felt that novel proteins were a good substitute for red and processed meat. But several participants saw them as just a continuation of meat industry power and a capitalist paradigm. So given that the meat industry were the ones buying up this new market. And many also saw the co-optation of the term plant-based as a symbol of their rising discursive power. One more surprising finding was how non-academic participants were framed. How non-academic participants framed the role of academics. So this wasn't a huge frame. As I'm presenting to a group of academics, I thought you'd be interested to hear. And I also think it's something positive to end on and encouraging for our own work. So academics were seen to have significant discursive power. So that is power in narratives. And several prominent academics, whose names I'm sure you could guess, were listed by industry participants as a threat to their own power. All this is important because the food system is highly politicized and corporatized, and many of the issues we face today are a direct result of those two factors. So achieving a healthy and sustainable food system depends on acknowledging these power asymmetries, understanding the political landscapes in which it operates, and designing policy measures that address power imbalances and externalities by multinational corporations. And if you'd like to see my first 2 PhD papers, they're just there. And this one will hopefully be published early next year. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. Oh, you're on mute, Tara.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? If there aren't any questions immediately, it's very nice to see that academics are actually seen to have some kind of power in the world. I was wondering if your focus was on international players as well. Did you look at, were there any differences that you noticed between countries, stakeholders in different parts of the world at all?
Yeah, definitely. So they're certainly within, I would say, of the academic and civil society participants, they were fairly homogenous in views and how they perceived the issue and framed the issue. But within the meat industry participants, there was a significant difference between ones in Australia and New Zealand and ones overseas. And I think that has to do with the fact that, I know particularly in Australia, the meat industry here really tries to distinguish itself from particularly the US meat industry, which is seen to be primarily factory farms and feedlots and very intensive. And whereas here in Australia, there's a lot of pastoral farming that's done, regenerative farming styles are becoming a bit more popular. And so I think there was a real effort to separate themselves from the US industry and yeah, not be kind of brushed with the same broad stroke.
Well, that leads me on to a question from Harriet Bartlett, which is linked to that. You talked about how they talked about intensive farming. Was there any discussion about the relative impacts of more extensive production systems if meat consumption were not curtailed, or was it simply assumed that it would somehow find its ecological level?
Yeah, that was different among different participants. I think all the industry participants, well, the meat industry ones certainly did seem to think that we could continue business as usual and just scale up these more regenerative or extensive farming production practices. But I would say almost every other participant referred to some of the evidence that said, they're just, perhaps we can get to a stage where we meet healthy consumption of red and processed meat, but certainly not the current levels of meat consumption that, it's incompatible with the natural resources that we have.
Great. I think we have time for, I think, 2 more questions. So a very quick one. When you talk about alternative proteins, do you mean cell-based meat or veggie burgers? Did they specify or lump them all together?
So when I say novel proteins, I'm talking about some of the newer alternative proteins that are being pushed as a kind of silver bullet. So that's plant-based imitation meats and cell-cultured meats. Did they distinguish? Not a lot. I had some civil society participants who were from almost vegan-based organizations that were advocating for a whole range of alternative protein sources that did really distinguish between which ones would be, which ones are kind of considered your everyday ones that are pre-existing in the market now. So tofu and soy-based alternatives. But yeah, I would say not as much.
Okay, and a final question, and if you could just address it really quickly because we're running out of time, from John Lynch. Towards the end, you ascribe the externalities to large multinationals. How do you think responsibilities or penalties for these should or shouldn't be passed down to individual farms, which may be quite small, who are supplying the multinationals?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's a complex one because I think you're right. There's people suffering on either side of these big meat packing companies. They are the farmers that get stuck in contracts with them, and obviously the consumers that then pay for the wider costs associated with their production. And I mean, my answer is no, I don't think they should lie on the individual farmers. I think they should. I think the big multinational companies that are, the ones who are, giving big political donations to governments around the world and trying to get through different regulations are the ones that probably need to be held the most accountable.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. There are a few more questions. I think it might be possible to kind of answer them in the Zoom afterwards if people would be interested in your response. So, but for now, let's move on to the second session, which is it's a double act between Kajsa Resare Sahlin, I hope I've pronounced that right, and Joanna Trewern. So Kajsa is a PhD student at Stockholm Resilience Centre, where she's exploring the idea of less and better meat. And Joanna is a PhD researcher at the University of Surrey's Centre of Environmental Strategy. It used to be called that, Centre of Environment and Sustainability, where she too is looking at pathways and strategies towards less and better. So without further ado, why don't you kick off?
Thanks, Tara. I'm just going to set up my screen here so you can see our presentation. Do you see that in presenter mode?
Yes, it's good now.
Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into this presentation where we're going to share some preliminary results from our working paper where we've reviewed the uses, definitions, and interpretations of the less but better meat concept. And as Tara mentioned, my name is Kajsa Resare Sahlin, and I'm a PhD candidate at Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. And I'll later hand over to Joanna Trewern, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Surrey. And similar to the previous speaker, this is also preliminary results, which we are about to submit. So please be mindful of that. So why a study on less but better meat? Well, firstly, it's increasingly presented as a potential pathway for more sustainable production and consumption, especially in high-income settings where we have this urgent need to actually cap livestock production numbers and also the associated intake. Growing urgency of this challenge, we've seen a surge of literature on meat reduction strategies and also on how to improve the sustainability of production. And as of yet, however, this literature is quite scattered, and we think that the less but better concept has a potential to act as a kind of umbrella for this body of literature and gather these insights to create a more common body of understanding around this topic. And but a prerequisite for this is, of course, that we understand how it's currently being used and defined and interpreted. So what we did in this study was that we conducted a systematic literature review following the PRISMA guidelines. And we've used different combinations of less and better in search strings on Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar, and retrieved 818 papers, which were published from year 2000 and onwards. And several of these papers were, of course, duplicates across the databases. And so those were removed, and we also removed any literature which did not focus on meat and livestock, and which this doesn't mention or go into less but better in any detail. So, for example, we've removed all of the kind of experimental studies where they've looked into the efficiency of a meat reduction strategy, but they don't link the results specifically to less but better and how that can kind of inform this concept theoretically. And in the end, this yielded us 35 scientific articles which specifically use the less but better concept and go into some kind of detail around how we can understand it and how it can be used. And then to analyze these papers, we developed a coding framework based on a previous article which I published together with some colleagues, which was the first article, and it came out in 2020, which actually focused specifically on the less but better concept and kind of trying to provide a more detailed characterization of this concept. And very briefly, we did find that the concept is being increasingly used. 2/3 of the published articles were published after year 2018. And there's also a clear focus among this literature on a Western high-income setting. All of the 35 studies actually came out of European, North American, or Australian research institutes. So there's that clear bias towards Western high-income settings. A core question that we keep asking ourselves, so to speak, is how much is actually less? How is it being characterized within this body of literature? And we found that actually all of the 35 articles address the need to reduce meat consumption in some way, but only 8 out of 35 papers actually provide some kind of description or characterization of how much less actually is. And these descriptions actually refer to, it can be either animal source foods or animal protein, which then also includes eggs and dairy, for example. But the descriptions of less can also refer to all meat consumption or specifically on meat protein. So there's a little bit of confusion there of what people are actually talking about. And for the articles where it was possible, we've normalized all of these values to grams of meat protein per person and day. And that's what you see in this graph here on the left-hand side. And the purpose of this figure is to kind of illustrate the range of different understandings of less that we found in this body of literature. But we urge you to be careful with exact comparisons of these figures, because most of the descriptions that we found in these papers are relative, for example, relative to current consumption, but the authors don't necessarily go into the exact consumption that they're referring to. And also there's a lack of clarity around metadata, for example, if they're referring to slaughter weight or bone-free meat or the kind of percentages of protein that they are considering. So that impacts the normalization of these values. So think about these more as an illustration of the range rather than the exact numbers. And actually only one paper in this review provides some kind of absolute definition of what less is then from a land use perspective. So all in all of the studies actually discuss reduced meat consumption and the need to reduce consumption, but not by how much. And then how do you measure, for example, progress or effectiveness if you don't know what the goal is? Like, how do you measure if a strategy is successful if you don't know what the end goal is in terms of a total then more sustainable consumption? But all in all, there's a bit of a vagueness around how much less meat actually is, but we can conclude that this literature clearly points to that it's considerably less than the current consumption in high-income countries. And with that, I'll hand over to Joanna. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kajsa. Come to the next slide, please. Fabulous, thanks. So in terms of kind of the other big bit of what we were looking at really was to try and understand what is better. And we did this mapping against the framework that Kajsa described, the thematic framework that we used for this study. And essentially what we found was that there was a big emphasis put on environmental aspects. And primarily, as you can sort of see from the size of the bubbles there was quite a lot on kind of broadly environmental quality, some more specific metrics such as carbon footprint. But really, when it came to other environmental metrics, there was not much on kind of anything beyond carbon, really. So very little on biodiversity, very little on fresh water, nutrient flows, etc. I think there was, the other things that got picked up really were land use and quite a bit on sort of better needing to reduce feed-food competition. The real gaps came as well when thinking about social and economic aspects. So one paper mentioned farmer well-being, one other mentioned the need for better meat to be economically viable. But there was nothing really beyond that. In terms of health, in terms of nutrition, there was nothing either on sort of linking meat types or meat produced in specific production systems to health outcomes. Most of the papers did mention a specific farming system, primarily organic, but also things like free range, extensive, pasture fed. This again was linked to that sort of need to reduce food competition. And then 2 papers mentioned agroecological systems as delivering better, and another 2 mentioned intensive systems of production. Next slide, please. Thank you. Something we found really interesting actually was sort of this link between practices and outcomes, or rather the lack of a link made in definitions. So what we found was that definitions of better made in these papers focused either on practices or outcomes, and really didn't make or weren't able to sort of link the 2. So you can see some examples on the left there of the practice-based definitions focused on sort of specific farming systems, and then on the right, some of those outcome-based definitions. So the challenge here is that we don't, from these papers anyway, that we looked at in this review, we don't get a good understanding of actually which systems deliver the outcomes that we want to see. So which farming systems deliver better animal welfare outcomes, for example, or better environmental outcomes, or better nutrition outcomes. Next slide, please. So we also looked at kind of how less and better are linked in the literature. And what we found is these 3 sort of overarching and conflicting narratives. The first one is around less for better. So the idea here is that you reduce stocking densities, and by doing that, you make room for better production, essentially, and you end up with fewer animals that have more space and are therefore healthier and happier, which came through in some of the papers we looked at. The second overarching narrative is around less as better. And here, really, the main point is that what we should all be doing is eating less, and better doesn't really matter in a way, or it's very much secondary. Within this, of course, we actually have to think what comes after the less, and is a scenario in which we potentially end up with production systems that don't deliver better outcomes a desirable one, even if it is at smaller scale. And the third overarching narrative was around better without less. And this was around improving the outcomes of production systems, and therefore not needing to actually reduce consumption or change consumer behaviour at all. The risk here is that we end up justifying or allowing for the continuation of business as usual. Next slide, please.
Can I just interrupt to say we're almost out of time? So you're on
last slide.
Right.
Sorry, I tried to rip through. Sorry about that. So in conclusion, essentially, as Kajsa said, the concept is being used more and more in Western high-income settings. There's a real lack of a definition of less that is absolute. Many of these definitions that we've seen are relative and talk about reducing consumption from current levels. Uses of better are kind of quite vague. There's no clear principles, no agreement on definition, and no firm link made between practices and outcomes. And in the future, really, what we need is a vision and common principles if this concept of less and better is to meaningfully inform policy and corporate decisions and build a more sustainable future for meat production and consumption. Thank you very much.
Great, well, thank you. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but there was an interesting comment posted by Bill Jeffrey. So I'm just going to read that out, and perhaps we can reflect on it. A challenge with the concept of less and better seems to be that it is discouraging and promoting beef at the same time, thus perhaps potentially undermining or nullifying the objective of reducing meat consumption. Focusing on the quantifying of the goals could help bring this into sharper focus. So yeah, thanks for that comment. So we're just now going to move on to our final speaker, who is Sylvia Pasterina, who's modelling of UK 2030 dietary forecasts under business as usual. And in order to give as much time as possible to present, I'm just going to say she's got a PhD from UCL, she's working at the London School, and you can read her biography online. So over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. I'm going to go to the presenter view. Can you see it now?
We can see the next slide as well. So it's
use slideshow maybe like this.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Sylvia Pastorino, and I've been working for about more than 1 year at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And the research that I'm presenting today is part of a larger project that is called Amphora, which aim to research action to reduce agriculture-related air pollution through dietary changes in the UK. So today I'm going to specifically present results from our preliminary results from the dietary modeling that we've done as part of this project. We're going to look at forecasting diet in the UK, as well as looking at policy scenario that could help reduce animal consumption in the UK. It's probably not need to say that animal products have higher environmental footprint than plant-based diets. As a reminder, the Committee on Climate Change recommended that if the UK wanted to meet their greenhouse gas emission target, ideally they should reduce all meat and dairy by 20% by 2030 compared to the baseline, which was about 2019-2020. To see what would be the better way or the best way possible to reach the CCC target, we decided to model 3 different future dietary scenarios to 2030. We had one baseline model was 2019, and one business as usual, which would be like 2030 future dietary forecast without any policies, and 2 policy scenarios, one based on tax and subsidies, that we call fiscal scenarios, and one based on innovation, which would aim to make both plant-based product and laboratory-produced meat more available and affordable for the population. As well as looking at how much each of these policy scenarios and forecasts will reach the CCC, we wanted to look at how much of this scenario would need to equal dietary guidelines, dietary guidelines, and what would be the greenhouse gas emission and water footprint of all 3 forecast scenario. We use the dietary data from the family food model, the living cost and food survey. This is a multi-stage stratified sample of about 5,000 households, which records all the quantity of food and drink purchased at the household level. In the household, every person above 7 is given a 2-week diary where they have to record everything that they have bought for consumption, as well as giving receipt of the purchases. We use all the available time series data from 2001 of the family food until to the latest available, which is 2018-19. We aggregated all the food groups in 19 food and drink, although here I'm going to present only selected food and drink, as it will be too much to present everything. And we scaled everything down to grams a day per person to make it more comparable with other existing survey. So to forecast and to model the forecast 2030 as business as usual, we imagine a scenario where no policy action would be introduced. And to model this scenario, we use past trends, and we assume that these past trends will continue into the future using random walk models. The fiscal scenario consisted of 20% meat and dairy tax and 20% fruit and vegetable subsidies. And this might be a little bit higher than what could be realistically introduced compared to taxes and subsidies that have been already introduced, but there is some evidence that these might be necessary to see some real changes. And to model the change in demand, following a change in price, we use the latest available UK-specific price elasticities, which are from 2009, and these have been calculated from DEFRA using actually the same family food data that we are using in this analysis. We used conditional and uncompensated price elasticity, although we did model with both unconditional and uncompensated as well, and they both show like quite similar results. In the new innovation scenario, we wanted to model how much traditionally farmed meat would be substituted with plant-based analog animal protein produced in laboratory if these new products were cheaper and would be more acceptable in taste for the population. To model these substitutions, we use market share from discrete choice experiment studies. These type of studies ask individuals to choose alternative future scenarios where they choose between alternatives that are equivalent in terms of price and taste. We also model how much each one of the scenarios would meet the 5 portion a day, and how much all the scenarios would stay within the red and processed meats recommendation or less than 70 grams per day. We use the footprint we use that come from the 2010 systematic review of global environmental impact of food. The GHG emissions are based on the CO2 equivalent, and the water use is fresh water withdrawal related to food consumption. To assign the appropriate and then the first results slide show the trajectory of past, which is the unbroken line, and predictive business as usual, which is the dotted line of selected food groups. And as you can see, like only 2 food groups are predicted to increase. One is the fruit and vegetable pulses in green, and one in the poultry and eggs, which is the bottom one. All the other major food groups are predicted to decrease or slightly decrease. And this is following continuous changes or decrease that we have seen in the past 20 years. Obviously, these are purchase rather than consumption, but we have seen there has been similar parallel in the national, in the NBNS survey. Here we compare the results from the different scenario with the baseline 2019 data. All the consumption you see here, they are in gram per day per person. So all the forecast scenario, both the forecast business as usual, which is like the darker one, and both the policy scenarios show lower red meat, poultry, and dairy consumption compared to baseline data. The scenario which showed the highest degrees in animal products was the innovation scenario, while the fiscal scenario showed also decreased animal consumption, animal product consumption, but also increased fruit and vegetable consumption. This is especially due to the subsidy on fruit and vegetable intake. We also forecasted that most of the substitution in the innovation meat would come from meat, from dairy and meat alternative. These are products that usually they're already in the market and include soy, pea protein, meat analog, and alternative dairy milks that are already on the market. As you can see, only the innovation scenario would reach the CCC target by 2020. However, the fiscal scenario would be very close, and the main reason for the fiscal scenario not to reach is due to the dairy consumption, but the meat consumption would actually decrease quite substantially even in the fiscal scenario. And although in the business as usual, we already see a decrease in meat and dairy this will not be nearly enough to meet the 2030 CCC target. In the Eat Well recommendation, we see on the right-hand side that both the fiscal scenario and the innovation scenario are within the ready process meal recommendation, but not the business as usual scenario. On the left side, you can see that none of the scenario will meet the 5-a-day recommendation for fruit and vegetables. So the fiscal scenario will be quite close. Again, these are purchases, so the actual consumption is going to be less than this. So probably other policy would be needed to reach a higher fruit and vegetable intake. And finally, we can see the footprint of all the scenarios, and as expected, consider that they had the lowest, the highest, decrease in meat and dairy intake. The greenhouse gas emission and water use were lower for the innovation scenario, followed by the fiscal scenario and the business as usual scenario. And then in conclusion, we can say that we can already see that there's going to be, there has been a meat and dairy reduction in the population in the UK, and that these consumption levels are predicted to change, continue in the future. However, these are not going to be enough change to meet the net zero target, and especially the CCC target, if we continue as business as usual. And both policy scenarios that we have modeled, they would have better dietary environmental outcome compared to business as usual. And according to our model, then most likely to be acceptable by the population will be switching to meat and dairy alternative rather than implementing fiscal scenario, fiscal disincentive. However, we haven't really modeled the nutritional, we haven't looked at the nutritional aspect of this meat and dairy alternative, and there might be, this is something that needs to be looked at, because some of these might not be necessarily beneficial. For example, they might be more processed and more high in food, in salt. The fiscal measure, they also will lead to lower meat intake, meat and dairy, and they also would lead to higher fruit and vegetable intake. However, this would be possible only if a subsidy would be combined with the meat tax. And thank you also want to thank the other people that work in the Amphora project and people that helped me with some of the modeling for the fiscal and environmental scenario. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left of this session. Please post your questions. In the meantime, I have a question which is about the innovation scenario. I may have missed this in your talk, but what was the assumed theory of change? Simply that if you innovate, then people will eat the stuff, or was there some additional mechanism assumed?
So we use to forecast the changing, we use discrete choice modeling studies. So in these studies, they ask individuals to choose between different scenarios, and the standard scenario, if you're in a cafeteria or in a shop and you have this alternative, what would you choose? And all the alternative would be comparable in price and taste. So usually they have a burger or something like red meat, and then they have something based on plant-based meat, and then culture meat. And it's mainly based on the fact that if these are available at the same price, which one would they choose? At the same time, in these studies, they give them a sort of talk and I'll tell them about the environmental. They are given information about how they're made and what would be like the environmental impact of each one of their choices. So, yeah, mainly based on the availability, the price, and the added benefit of these choices, really.
Thank you. And you didn't combine scenarios, combine the sort of fiscal and the innovation?
We plan to do that, something similar like that in the main Amphora project, yes. However, because we use different methods, they are separately, so we don't really know what would be the interaction. It would be difficult, I guess, to make assumption about, but I would assume that if you combine, for example, a subsidy with making meat subsidy more available, probably that would reach the highest benefits.
Okay. Well, I think we're all out of time now, so just a big thank you to all the speakers, and for people attending. Please, can you just remember to go on to the next session when it starts. So thank you very much, and we'll end the session now.